Good afternoon, everyone. Dr. Pasapong Sipijan, our faculty dean, Dr. Sanut Sekuntot Nathalang, our moderator today, and very special good morning to our speaker today, Professor Dr. Michael Byram. We are very glad to see you today. Okay, I'm Sane Thongrin, Associate Dean for Research of Liberal Arts, Dhammaศาสตร์ University. I'm so happy to welcome everyone to our session today, right? We have a workshop on materials and methods in intercultural foreign language education. Actually, we plan to set this workshop as the on-site at Thapajan campus. However, Dr. Michael Byram found that he had some health problems, so he but he still insists to help us, right? So we switched from the on-site workshop to its online version. Thank you so much, Ajahn Mike, to help us. I appreciate your heart and love to help us all along, right? And today we are very lucky to have Dr. Sanut Sekuntot Nathalang, who helped us as the moderator today. Dr. Sanut is from the translation program of Dhammaศาสตร์ University, so she will be assisting us with anything for the discussion or any question you may have during the session. All right, so before we start, I would like to invite our Dean, Dr. Pasapong Sipijan, to welcome everyone. Dr. Pasapong and the teams always support us all along, morally and most importantly, financially. So please join me in a warm welcome. Dr. Pasapong, please.
สวัสดีครับ Good afternoon, everyone, and very warm welcome to the Faculty of Liberal Arts, Dhammaศาสตร์ University Research Workshop number 36, if I'm not wrong, which shows, how active Dr. Sane, our Vice Dean for Research, and her dedicated team in organizing, talks and workshops with the aim of enhancing research skills and publication skills as well for our faculty members, of course, graduate students, and of course, as academic services to the public as well. And I would like to once again welcome Professor Dr. Michael Byram to Liberal Arts, maybe online this time first. Yeah, of course, Professor Byram has been a regular and most important mentors. He has taught and served in examination committees for our MA and PhD in English language studies. And yeah, you can see he has given a lot of talks and workshops for us. And most recently, he has been awarded the Bua Luang Chair Professorship as a visiting professor who is leading, our research team with the hope of producing high impact, research. So, and of course, we don't have to go through the list of his publications, especially in the field of intercultural communication today. But I'm very delighted to have this talk today because usually or very often we got some very mild but friendly complaints from different people, that especially the ELT practitioners, that okay, they might not want to go too deep into the theories, but they would like to use some concepts of ICC in the real teaching situations. But I'm sure today we have both. I'm sure we will learn more about theories and principles of intercultural communication. And at the same time, I'm sure Dr. Byram would, give us some idea about how to make it practical to our teaching situation. So without further ado, I would like to finish my opening remark and then proceed to the talk itself. Thank you very much and enjoy the talk. Thank you.
Okay, shall I start now? Everyone can hear me clearly, right? Okay. Good morning to Professor Byram. I believe that in England now it's the morning time, right? Okay. And good afternoon to all of us in Thailand. I can see that there are as many as 87 people attending this conference. So it is a success already, right? So I would like to welcome all of us online to this conference, Materials and Methods in Intercultural Foreign Language Education. Just the name itself sounds very interesting. I'm very happy to see many people joining the event today to discuss and explore important topics in intercultural education. My name is again Sanut, and I'll be your moderator for this event. As today we're meeting online, please ensure that your microphone are muted when not speaking. This is in order to minimize the background noise. And during the talk, if you have any questions, please leave them either in the chat box or you can raise your hand. You can use the emoticon sticker or something. You can raise your hand, and if I can see that you raise your hand, I can give you the floor to ask Professor Michael Byram. Okay. I'm particularly excited to introduce our keynote speaker, Professor Michael Byram, and please excuse me if I have to look at my notes, because the list of his publications and everything that he has done is so much that I can't remember. Okay, so first of all, Professor Michael Byram is Professor Emeritus at the University of Durham in the UK and a Fellow of the Academy of Social Sciences. He read modern and medieval languages at King's College, University of Cambridge, completed a PhD in Danish literature, and then taught French and German in secondary and adult education. He has been at Durham University since 1980, engaged in teacher training, research student supervision, and research on languages and education. After retirement from Durham, he was visiting professor at the University of Luxembourg, where he still teaches on a master's course. He is currently guest research professor, Sofia University, St. Clement, Oriski, where he is involved in a comparative study of the assessment of the PhD in a dozen universities across the world. His monographs include Teaching and Assessing Intercultural Communicative Competence and From Foreign Language Education to Education for Intercultural Citizenship. He has also edited several volumes, including the second edition of the Routledge Encyclopedia of Language Teaching and Learning with Edo Haihu, the Common European Framework of Reference, the Globalization of Language Education Policy with Lynn Parmenter, Teaching Intercultural Competence Across the Age Range from Theory to Practice with Manuela Wagner and Jory Conlon Perugini, and lastly, to name but a few, the doctorate as experience in Europe and beyond. So he was throughout the 2000s an advisor to the Council of Europe Language Policy Division, and then a member of the working group which produced the Council of Europe's reference framework of competences for democratic culture and the accompanying portfolio. We're very honored to have him with us today. Without further ado, please join me in welcoming Professor Michael Byram.
Thank you very much, everybody, for your kind words and invitation to be here. Here, actually, I'm in France rather than in England, but it is morning. And so good afternoon to you from me in the morning. And I apologize that I can't be there as originally planned, but there were some difficulties. One thing, it occurs to me, at least my environmental footprint has been reduced a little bit by not flying, but that's only a small compensation. I would like to share my screen with you. And now I am told by my screen that you can see my screen and my title, Materials and Methods in Intercultural Foreign Language Education.
Yes.
Great, thank you for assuring me of that. Now, as our Dean said, I'm going to try to do something which is more practical, but at the same time, I want to put that into a context, into a theoretical context, but also a philosophical context to a certain extent. So I have 3 parts to this talk, and I think we will have a break after the second part, so that you can relax as well, because I know for everybody it's very hard to concentrate through Zoom and so on. So I have 3 parts. One where I look at with the title Keywords and Perspectives, looking at words like foreign language, intercultural, and education from my title. The second part focusing upon what to teach, but what kind of knowledge and to teach. The third part will be focused on the practical matters of how to put all of that into practice and into operation. So I'm going to start then with some keywords, foreign language, intercultural, and education. So what then is my understanding and our understanding of foreign? In our education systems, many subjects, perhaps most subjects in schools and universities are national, particularly in schools where young people learn about their own country, their own language, their own literature, history and society, and so on. That is the way in which education works, and rightly so. But foreign language teaching is different. It's international rather than national, and usually the focus is on other countries' languages, literatures, histories, and societies, whether it's in the school sector or in higher education. And as was said in the introduction, I began my professional life as a language teacher. I was a teacher of French and German as foreign languages in an English school, secondary school. And in a sense, I always felt a little bit different from other teachers, particularly the English teachers, but also other teachers, because we were orientated in our languages department, we were orientated internationally. For example, any letter which came to the school from a foreign country was automatically given to me, even though it wasn't addressed to me. So I was seen, or we were seen, as the international people in the school. That's different, of course, from teaching a second language. And it's important to make a distinction between teaching English and other languages, but this afternoon we'll focus upon English. Teaching English as a second language is different from teaching English as a foreign language. For example, those who teach English in Nigeria, India, and so on, where the language is very much the language of one of the languages of the country, there the focus is not on other countries and internationalism in the way that teaching a foreign language is. So let's make that distinction from the beginning. I think it's also important to contrast foreign language teaching with English as a medium of instruction, where English is, as in Hong Kong or in Taiwan, and in other places, where English is a medium of instruction. Again, the focus is not on other countries, it's on the subject being taught, of course. So there's another distinction to be borne in mind there. But then if we stick with foreign and other countries, which other countries are going to be associated with English? Is it going to be English-speaking countries like the United States, the United Kingdom, Australia, or what? Which other countries is one of the questions which arises when we think of foreign language teaching and English as a foreign language. And secondly, this is my second key word, what then do we mean by teaching language? There are different views about this with respect to intercultural foreign language teaching. I often hear people say teaching a language, and they mean a foreign language, is teaching culture. Teaching language is teaching culture. Because I hear people say language and culture are inseparable. And then they might say, well, in that case, I don't need to teach culture as such or intercultural competence as such, because by teaching language, I am teaching culture. That's one view. Another view is that English is a world or an international language and useful for presenting our country to the world, and therefore teaching about United States or United Kingdom or other English-speaking countries is not the purpose. That is partly one of the policies in Japan, for example. One view of English teaching in Japan is that it is a means of presenting our country to the world. I've seen the same kind of perspective in other countries too. So that's another view on what we mean by teaching language and teaching language and culture. However, there is a problem with these views, particularly with the first one, because it's not self-evident, and research has shown us that, first of all, teaching language does not necessarily create a knowledge and understanding of other cultures, whichever other cultures we're talking about. It certainly does not create a systematic knowledge and understanding of other cultures. When I was teaching French in a secondary school, we did not teach systematically. And my students, they learned something from me and my colleagues about France and Germany, and perhaps Austria and other French-speaking countries, but it certainly was not systematic, and I was never very happy with what we were doing. And when I therefore did some research, when I moved to the university system, to investigate whether in fact teaching French as a foreign language led to a systematic understanding and knowledge about France or French-speaking countries, and whether it led to a more positive attitude towards other countries. Those were our research questions. Does French teaching lead to systematic knowledge and better understanding? And does French teaching lead to a more open, tolerant attitude to France and other foreign countries? The answer to those questions was no, not systematically at least, and certainly not in any way that we could identify through our research data. So teaching language does not necessarily mean the same as teaching culture. Furthermore, if you look a bit more carefully at this claim that language and culture are inseparable, in fact, that's not the case. One needs to think a little harder, and of course we know that English is combined with other cultures than US American or British. It's also combined with Indian culture, Australia, and other English-speaking countries, so that it's And of course, it's not just English. French is a similar situation, that French is, of course, combined with the culture of France. I'm using a phrase there which we'll have to think a bit harder about in a moment, but let's be simple. French is connected with the culture of France, but it's also connected with the culture of Canada. It's also connected with the culture of French-speaking Africa, and so on. So it's not just a matter of English. It is therefore possible for a language to be combined with more than one culture, and it's not inseparable from the obvious connection with one of the English-speaking or French-speaking countries. So that raises the question, again, which other countries? Since English is not just a matter of United Kingdom and the United States, what about other countries? Which other countries remains an open question for us still. Or we can ask a new question, because if we take seriously the idea that English is an international language, or a world language as it's sometimes called, then rather than thinking of questions about which other countries we should teach about, there is a question, a point of view which says, well, since English is an international or a world language, why teach culture at all? Why not just use it as a means of interacting across the world and use it as a lingua franca, which has no connection with any culture whatsoever? So that's another question for us to think about. Now I come to my third key word, this word in my title, intercultural. When are we intercultural, and how is culture presented in international or world English, since that was the question which I've just raised on the previous slide. So my example here, just to make clear what I mean by this, is from your part of the world. Some years ago, Ross Taylor was later a colleague, but at the time a PhD student with me, and he carried out an experiment where he had two people speaking English, one from Thailand and one from Malaysia. And those two people speaking English, therefore, as an international or world language, or a lingua franca, depending on your perspective, those two people, he had them talk about family matters. And he videoed what they were doing and asked them to look at the video after they'd had their conversation, and they analysed together what they'd been thinking as they talked about their families and as they, for example, used the word father. And what they said when he stopped the video and said, okay, you've just talked about your father here, or you've just talked about being a father in your family, what was going through your mind? What were the connotations of the word father for you? What was in the back of your mind as you were using this word? And what each of them said was different from what the others said. One was thinking of their experience and their concept of father in Thai and the other in Malay. But they were also thinking about their own personal identification with the word father and their understanding of the word father. So it was not true that they were understanding the word in the same way. They were understanding each other to some extent, but to a limited extent, because each was bringing to that word a different set of connotations and a different usage. And when it came to the next part of the investigation and the experiment, where he asked people to talk about their profession, about politics, and so on, then there was even more confusion and misunderstanding because even more complicated topics were being discussed. So that was, for me, a very important piece of work on what happens when English is used as a lingua franca. Well, that means then that even when English is being used as an international world or lingua franca language, it is connected with culture. There is meaning in the words, which is specific to how people are using the words. And in that sense, they're using the words and the language to talk about our culture, our country, even when they're interacting with someone in another country. Now, I've begun to put the phrase our culture in inverted commas, in quotation marks, because that, of course, is also a complex notion. My next key word is education. I use the word foreign language education rather than foreign language teaching. And the reason for that is that, of course, I see foreign language education as giving our learners, whatever age they are, something which is useful. They will have an instrument, a capacity, a competence in a foreign language, which will be useful to them. But it's at least in the teaching of languages in schools and universities, which are institutions of education and not just instruction, then in those situations, in those institutions, foreign language education, teaching education, should also be, and is, I think, humanistic and in that sense educational. So it's not just a matter of teaching and instruction, but a matter of humanistic education. And that, I think, is becoming more and more evident and talked about after a period in the late part of the previous century when the instrumental dimension of language education and teaching was emphasized. I've got two examples, one from two quite different countries, one from China and in a moment from Norway, from a very large country, not very far from where you are, and from a very small country, which is quite a long way from where you are. But it's interesting that in these documents from these two countries, the notion of humanistic is present. This is a translation done by some colleagues of mine from a document on the teaching of what is called college English in universities in China. That is English which is taught to all students and not just English majors. So this is what it says. College English curriculum is not only a basic language course, but also, and therefore instrumental, but also a quality-oriented education course to broaden knowledge and understand world culture, both instrumental and humanistic. And they go on to say the integration of this humanistic quality education into college English teaching can cultivate students' sense of social responsibility through subtle influence, etc., etc. So there's a clear statement about the humanistic dimension, even for those students who are not English majors. And maybe I shouldn't say even for, but also for those students. It's not for whom English, of course, is a useful instrument, but it's also something else. In the other country, in Norway, the statement is very similar. In its document, which policy document for the teaching of languages in schools in Norway, under the aims for language teaching. They say foreign languages are both an educational subject and a humanistic subject. Competences in language and culture shall give the individual the possibility to understand and to live into, that's a literal translation, which I did, living into and valuing other cultures, social life and life at work, their modes and conditions of living, their way of thinking, their history, art and literature. And it's interesting to notice the emphasis upon other cultures, and in fact they don't focus only on English-speaking countries, but we'll come back to that. They go on then to say that this area of study, language education, can also contribute to developing interest and tolerance and develop insight into one's own conditions of life and own identity, and contribute to joy in reading, creativity, experience, and personal development. This, I think, is important and something which is not so clearly stated yet in many documents, that language teaching and education is not only about understanding and living into other cultures, but also developing insight into one's own conditions of life, which is another phrase for culture, of course, and one's own identity and personal development. So there are two sides to this coin. So let me just summarize what I've said so far. That teaching culture needs to be explicit. Now, again, the word culture is in quotation marks, and we'll come back to that. Because contrary to what many people say, and what I have often heard, it's not the case. Research has shown that it's not true that simply teaching language will inevitably lead to better knowledge about other cultures and countries. That is clearly not the case. Secondly, I've suggested that even if English is seen as a world language, international language, lingua franca, etc., even there is culture present in the situation. From Ross Taylor's example, you bring into that situation your own culture. And therefore we need to think hard about what teaching English as a world language means in this respect. And thirdly, from this last couple of slides, the importance of remembering that learning a foreign language leads to, or can lead to, and perhaps should lead to, and that's a big step to say should, lead to a reflection on oneself and one's own culture and country, as well as an understanding and knowing about another culture and country. And I think that noticing ourselves and understanding how others might see us is also necessary for effective communication. All of that is part of the instrumental dimension of language education, but it's also part of those humanistic purposes which I've emphasized from those two documents, which I've chosen as contrasting places and countries, but you'll find, I think, increasingly reference to those humanistic purposes in other countries and documents and policies as well. So those are my key words and principles. And let me now move to the second dimension of what I want to say. Teaching culture is often seen as a matter of teaching knowledge of some kind, knowledge about another country and culture in the traditional way, but perhaps also then knowledge about our own country and culture and our own self. So we need to look at this idea of knowledge. Traditionally, as I said, traditional culture teaching is knowledge about a country. And what that might then mean in practice has to be worked out in detail. It implies that there is a culture of a foreign country. And I used at the beginning the notion of French culture. That in itself is something that needs to be thought seriously about. Is there such a thing as French culture? If you're a teacher of French, can you teach French culture? Does that make sense? My short answer to that would be yes, there is a sense in which people who live in France acknowledge that there is a shared culture, way of behaving, way of believing and set of values. So knowledge, culture as behavior, beliefs and values. There is a shared culture that everybody knows about, and a lot of it comes through going to school in France and being introduced to French language, standard language, and perhaps learning it as separate from your own language, whether your own language is a dialect of French or your own language is another language than French, if you're the child of immigrants, for example. So there is a sense in which everybody knows about and learns the language of the country, the history of the culture of the country, the literature of the country. Whether everybody feels identically loyal to and identifies with that culture as presented by schools and universities is a different question. But there is a sense in which everybody is introduced to that national culture. But there's also a sense in which there are many other shared ways of thinking, living, behaving, values and beliefs in groups within the geographical boundaries of France. There are many groups, both ethnic groups and regional groups, which also have their languages, histories, geographies, literatures. And someone who is a serious student of French language and culture at, for example, university level, would be someone who wants to know not just about the dominant culture of the country as promoted by the education system, but also about all those other cultures. But not everybody is going to spend their life being a serious student of British culture in the way that someone might be a serious student of French culture. So there is a sense then in which knowledge about a country has meaning. In the contemporary development towards intercultural competence, then there too, in the notion of intercultural competence, there is a room for, space for, a place for knowledge about a country which need not necessarily be one of the English-speaking countries. It might just be knowledge about some other countries or one other country, which is perhaps near to where our students are and with which they might have interaction. But that knowledge about that country through the teaching and learning of English is also a part of intercultural competence. But even in this contemporary development towards intercultural competence as the aim of language teaching, the traditions are that teaching culture is teaching knowledge about a country and often an English-speaking country. Those traditions are still strong. And I have to say that I find it very difficult sometimes when speaking with teachers to explain and for them to understand that as a teacher of English, you do not need necessarily to teach about Britain or the United States. However, that tradition is still strong and we need to think about it carefully. So we should certainly teach knowledge, but I think there are two kinds of knowledge. Two kinds of knowledge. And I've only talked about one kind of knowledge so far. Both kinds of knowledge are important. And indeed, one, you might argue, and I will argue, is more important than the other. Those two kinds of knowledge are what are called declarative and procedural, or sometimes propositional and procedural knowledge. So knowledge about another country and culture. That is what I've been talking about so far in this part. That is not declarative, propositional knowledge. And when we did our research all those years ago to find out whether teaching French led to learning knowledge about France in a systematic way, then we were investigating whether learners acquired propositional knowledge about France in their French lessons. And we investigated that and had different ways of collecting data about that. We found that they did acquire some propositional knowledge about France, but it was very unsystematic and very arbitrary. Sometimes they remembered things that their teacher had told them. Sometimes they remembered something that had been in the textbook, but none of it was systematic. Nonetheless, propositional knowledge has a place. However, we have to contrast and compare propositional knowledge with procedural knowledge, knowing how to. And this, or if you like, know-how, or if you prefer the word skill, but knowing how is an important dimension of knowledge, an important kind of knowledge, a kind of knowledge which schools and universities have traditionally not paid much attention to. And I say traditionally, I mean up to the late 20th century and perhaps even beyond. And it was only in the second half of the 20th century when philosophers began to think hard about kinds of knowledge that the emphasis on knowing how and skills became something important for schools and education generally. So what do I mean by these two dimensions or these two kinds of knowledge? Well, we're all language teachers, so let me just take that as a simple example. There is the knowing about or knowing that. The third person present tense in English ends in S. That's propositional knowledge, which we teach. And when I was learning foreign languages, that was all that I learned. I did not learn the second kind of knowledge, knowing how to use the third person singular and to use it in fluent speech and in fluent writing. That, of course, today is also taught in language teaching. But we do teach two kinds of knowledge in language teaching. The first does not necessarily lead to the second. And when I was taught languages and when I was taught only propositional knowledge about French and German, then it took me a long time to change that propositional knowledge into know-how and be able to actually use that propositional knowledge. But things have changed since then, I'm glad to say. So what does that mean then? That's, I'm sure, familiar to all of us. In a cultural sense, again, this is a simple example. There is the propositional knowledge of the type, I know that Washington is the capital of the USA and not New York, as many people initially think. So that's propositional knowledge that might be acquired when learning English as a foreign language. But there's another kind of knowledge which might be used, might be learnt in the language classroom. That's procedural knowledge. I know how to find out the capital of a country using English because I'm in a English language classroom. So that would be procedural knowledge, knowing how to do that for myself without being told by the teacher or the textbook what is the capital of the United States. Those two examples then, to clarify, I hope, the distinction between knowing about and knowing that and knowing how. I'm sure you all know this saying, give a man a fish and you feed him for a day. Teach a man to fish and you feed him for a lifetime. I'm sure you all know that. What I'm going to argue is that on the basis of that way of thinking, know-how, skill, procedural knowledge is more important than knowing that. It's more important to know how to find out the capital of a country than to be told by the teacher or textbook what the capital of a country is. However, traditional textbooks were limited and perhaps still are limited if they're still being used to giving knowledge about. And it's often rather random information, perhaps rather than knowledge. There's arbitrary information about a country, which is often in traditional textbooks something which is added to the end of a unit of language teaching with no clear rationale as to why that particular topic should be used or introduced. And in that sense, I think I would call that information rather than knowledge. And secondly, unfortunately, that knowledge or information is often a stereotype of a country, of the kind, and I've invented this, but I think this is the sort of thing that you find, British people eat bacon and eggs for breakfast. That's the sort of thing that you find in traditional textbooks. It implies a stereotype because although it does not say so, the word ALL, all British people eat bacon and eggs for breakfast, is what is implied. And that then is a stereotype. And of course, stereotypes are never true, never precise, never exact, because all you need is one exception to that statement, and that exception will prove that that statement is untrue. But that's the kind of, and I may be exaggerating a little here and for my argument, but that's the kind of information or knowledge which is given. And I have to say, it's the kind of information I've seen in textbooks that have been used in England. But we do have the internet. So we might say, okay, we can use the internet instead of the textbook, and that will give us more up-to-date knowledge, up-to-date information rather than knowledge, I would say. But beware, I would say, about the internet. I looked on the internet for information about breakfast in Britain. And you can easily, if you put in search words like breakfast in Britain, then you will see, well, you can see my search word at the top. British people eat bacon and eggs. And what did I find? Lots of descriptions and websites where I could get more information on what is the traditional full English breakfast, as it's usually called. And your learners might easily find those, and that's the first thing they will find. However, if they go a little bit further and find and search a little bit more and use their internet know-how, then actually it doesn't quite fit that this first search provides you with information which is accurate. And they can easily find a bit more if they search further and discover that fewer and fewer people have time to eat a proper breakfast. In other words, a full English breakfast. And in fact, if they go a little further, they find that most people, the number one choice for breakfast is cereal and not bacon and egg and the full English breakfast, cereal or toast, and for many, perhaps very little at all. So beware of the internet as a means of teaching knowledge which is propositional, knowledge that and knowledge about. So let me now summarize the second part of what I've been saying. Information about is often stereotyped. Knowledge, which is actually more like information about, is often stereotyped, and it can be based on outdated tradition and wrong. So we need to be careful about what we teach if we decide that it's appropriate to teach knowledge about another country, an English-speaking country. But I think my second point about knowledge is that it's more important to teach procedural knowledge than to teach propositional knowledge. Not that procedural knowledge should replace procedural knowledge, but it is, in a sense, more important. It will be the fishing rod rather than the fish. And be careful about the internet. It needs to be used carefully, and knowing how to use the internet is just as much as part of our teaching knowledge how as other things.
Okay.
So in a moment, I'll go on to the third part, but I was thinking we might have a short break here.
Right.
And maybe then have some questions.
Yes,
after
okay.
a short break.
I was about to ask the audience to kind of leave the second part with some thoughts. And while they're doing that, we are going to take a break. And then should we come back with questions afterwards, after 10 minutes break? Yes, would that be okay with
yes.
you? Okay.
That's right. Let's do that. Yes.
Right. Now it's 1:54, 1:55 in Thailand. So let's do 10 minutes break, and then we'll come back with questions, and Professor Byram would probably be having some drinks and ready to give us some answers. Okay. 10 minutes break. Okay. All right.
Thank you, Grace. Thank you.
Okay. Okay, our break time is almost up. To be exact, it's right now. We're very punctual, and we try to keep the time, to the schedule. Right. Has everybody come back from the break? If not so, please do so, because Professor Byram is now waiting with a lot of eagerness to answer very interesting questions from the audience. Okay. For those of you who are present right now, would you like, anyone wants to start with? you can open your microphone and then turn on your microphone and then start asking the question.
There are also 2 questions in the chat.
Oh,
I've
really?
seen.
Okay.
Yes, yes.
Let me go back to the chat. My chat is not updated. I'm so sorry about that. Would you like to ask that yourself, Deepley? If I mispronounce your name, please forgive me.
Yes, thank you, ma'am.
Okay, yes.
My name is Yip. Dear Professor, I would like to repeat my questions here. If I conduct research on English written discourse analysis regarding same kind of information between 2 or 3 countries, is this an intercultural or cross-cultural study? And is this appropriate for cross-cultural pragmatics? Thank you.
Sorry. Yes, I think it is. I mean, it's a comparative research study, which will provide you with knowledge about the modes of discourse which differ from your learner's mode of discourse. And I think we're probably talking now about advanced learners and how they might need to understand other modes of discourse and have some knowledge about those other modes of discourse, as well as then adapt to them and have some knowledge how to use them. In a sense, these are language matters rather than cultural matters, but of course this is where language and culture are overlapping. So my short answer is yes, that is an appropriate dimension to teaching and learning, intercultural language teaching and learning.
Okay, right. If I can go on to the next sort of question in the chat box, it's actually a request to see the slide with part 2 summary again.
Yes, I did that. Yes, I saw that. I put that up. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Is there
Yeah.
any specific question you would like to ask Bridget? And again, if I mispronounce your name or I call you in the wrong way, culturally speaking, please forgive me. Is there any specific question to this slide that you would like to ask Professor Byram?
Good afternoon, everyone. I don't have a specific question. I'm just writing down notes, so I'd like to view the slide again if possible. Thank you.
Okay, no problem. All right, let's move on to the next question, which is from Kun Gittipong. Would you ask Professor yourself?
ได้ครับอาจารย์
Okay, come back.
Professor Mike, study with you last night. I mean, I'm a student at the moment, but I was a former cross-cultural trainer for Peace Corps. That I wonder the word cross-cultural and intercultural, is there any different meaning? Like when we do the cross-cultural things, we help our volunteer to be able to adjust themselves and live successfully or happily in Thailand. They're from America. So that means that it has been crossover between 2 culture, Thai and American culture. And how about the word intercultural? Is a different meaning? Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Good to see you, Kit.
ครับ
I don't think there's a substantial difference. I think there's a tradition in the world of business. You talk about the Peace Corps, but in the world of the business and commerce, training, and Peace Corps and volunteers and so on were some of the earliest people to be involved in working in another country. They're not business people, but they are usually working and volunteering in another country. And that they were some of the first people to be trained, and it was in the training and working with those people that the the theories of E.T. Hall and other people began to develop. And at that time, we're talking about the 1950s, I suppose, now, the phrase cross-cultural was used. I myself and other people have preferred intercultural, but what you actually do with, and what you're trying to theorize and do in practice doesn't differ from in those two traditions to any substantial degree. Perhaps intercultural is more associated with also learning a language, whereas cross-cultural training often does not focus upon language learning, whereas in the way that those of us dealing with intercultural competence include language learning as part of what is necessary. So that's perhaps a difference, but it's not always the case that cross-cultural training does not focus on language. So this is a tendency rather than an absolute distinction.
Right, you're right. Because when we do the training for them, we teach them like how to say no in Thai context and how to live in Thailand. What about like sexual conduct in Thailand, like that?
Yes,
We do a lot of culture side. And we also have the class like Thai language also, but separately. Thank you.
Yes.
Okay.
But in the world of business training, just let me add briefly, in the world of business training, sorry, those who train people to work to go to another country as part of their business life, in commerce and so on, such trainers often have only a short period of time with their trainees, and for all kinds of reasons, and therefore cannot focus upon proper language learning, because language learning takes time, of course. So that's a tendency not to focus on language. However, sorry, there was something else you wanted to introduce.
No. I was going to say, I thought that you finished. I'm sorry I interrupted you.
That's fine.
Okay, I think we have the last question from Kun Suriporn. Would you like to ask the professor yourself?
Hi. I'm Suriporn from Pisonolog, Pibun Songkram Rajapat University, Pisonolog. Well, I really want to be more specific on the two kinds of knowledge, the propositional and procedural knowledge. So my question is, could you please give us some ideas what could be the most suitable proportion of both kinds of knowledge that we have to, deliver to our learners in the teaching situation? Thank you.
Did you say proportion?
Propositional, I think. Oh, okay.
Propositional and procedural knowledge.
Yes. But did you say what proportion of time should be given to each? Is that your question?
That's right, Professor.
Yes. Okay. Well, it's a difficult question, and in a sense, it's an impossible question. But in a sense, the two go together, and that's also will become clear in the next part when I move to the next part. That there is a sense in that it's important to not to say propositional knowledge is out of the window. We forget propositional knowledge. I'm not saying that. But what I am saying is that when you decide that something is an important topic for learners, and they need to acquire some propositional knowledge about a country, and in cross-cultural training that might be the case too, then it can be combined with procedural knowledge, that learners should learn how to find out that propositional knowledge themselves. So you might give them a small fish, about information about another country, and then you might focus more upon giving them the fishing rod and the procedural knowledge so that they can find out more for themselves. I hope that gives you an answer, but in a sense, what I'm going to move on to next is part of that issue as well. So shall I continue then?
Yeah, okay. Is there any other question that
I was looking at
anybody
the
wants
chat.
to ask? Right, there is no more question. So in that case,
No,
yeah, okay, we carry on. Okay.
okay, thank you. So now then to part 3. It's got it, not my voice. Part 3, methods and materials. First of all, methods. What I want to argue and show you now is that language learners can become ethnographers. An ethnographer is someone who discovers about the way of life of another group. In the traditional sense, it was, of course, people who went to distant countries from Europe and North America to South America or the Pacific Islands. But ethnographers in the late 20th century and today are also interested in their own country and social groups in their own country. And there's a long tradition of doing ethnographic studies of schools and universities, for example, but ethnographic studies in professions and studying the work of lawyers or the work of medics, of doctors. So ethnography is the model, or the ethnographer is the model, the person who wants to find out for themselves. And that is procedural knowledge that they need, the skills that they need to do that. That is the starting point for what I want to say with respect to methods. It's therefore important that our learners develop skills of knowing how to observe, to analyze, to discover for themselves, to discover knowledge about, to discover propositional knowledge using their procedural knowledge or their skill. But it should be also a matter of discovering knowledge about others and discovering knowledge about ourselves. Because just to remind you, the purpose that was proposed for language education in Norway is to give the individual the possibility to understand, so the fishing rod, to live into and to value other cultures, but also to develop insight into one's own conditions of life and culture and identity. So this procedural knowledge is a means of understanding others, acquiring propositional knowledge about others, but also about oneself. Knowledge which you might think, well, we all know about ourselves, but the whole point of analyzing and observing others is that makes you think about yourself in a different way. So language learners as curious ethnographers is my key phrase here. Knowing how to discover others and their society, knowing how to discover ourselves and our own society. Skills of data collection and data analysis, but these are skills which are taught, and I'm thinking in schools now, but also in universities, and our university students will have been to school, of course. So it's not that we as language teachers need to teach all the skills of data collection and analysis. Our learners in other subjects across the curriculum are often learning in geography, sociology, to collect data and analyze data. We might want to focus on how they can use that using English rather than their own language, since we are teachers of English as a foreign language, and therefore we might want to adapt what they're doing. But I think if you ask your students, have you done surveys? Have you done analyses of data of different kinds? They will say, yes, we did it in sociology or geography or even in history. So I want to emphasize that it's not just our job. I want to give you an example now, again from Norway, and it's an example from primary school. And I don't know how many people in the audience are primary school teachers of English. There may not be many, and I'm sure there are others who are secondary and university teachers. But I hope that if I give you a primary school example, it first of all is simple, it simplifies matters and is easy to show my point. And I'm sure then that you will be able to develop and think about how this can be applied to your own learners and your own teaching. So this is a couple of pages from a primary school book for teaching English in Norway. And what you see here is that this is a document. Somebody is writing on my screen. This is a document about life in Norway. So this is something that a family is being introduced, and it's a Norwegian family. You may not, I don't know how much you can read the writing, it's quite small, but this is, my name is Rachel, this is my wife Sarah. We live with our dogs. I'm Tormod, and this is my mother Mary. This is my stepfather Kjell, my stepsister Hanni Marie. And then on the right-hand side, something about my family, and the instructions are what did you just read? List the key words, use them to talk to your learning partner. And each child in this book, in this course, has a learning partner that they work with regularly. So that phrase is known to the learners at this point. What is your family like? Is it typical? So they have to then talk about, in English, their own family with their learning partner, and compare their learning partner's family with their own and with the textbook family, or families rather, that we've just seen on the opposite page. And then there's the question, is there something that is a typical Norwegian family? Which of these families resembles your family the most? In what way? What can be good about being part of a family, and so on? Discuss with your learning partner again. So what we see from this is that the students, the learners, are encouraged to discover about something from their learning partner, about Norwegian families, and about us, by talking to their partner, by asking the question, what is your family like? And then comparing. So discovering and comparing are important key words here, which are part of the procedural knowledge that I'm focusing upon. And at the same time, there is a deliberate attempt to ensure that the students avoid stereotyping. There is a question, is there something which is a typical Norwegian family? That was on the second page. And the answer is implied no. And they will, of course, discover that the answer is no, because when they discover their learning partner's family and other families in the classroom in which they're learning English, they will discover that there is no such thing as a typical Norwegian family. Norway is a multicultural society, and some of the names of the families on the previous page are not traditional Norwegian names. So the answer will be no. And that's quite a deliberate introduction into this part of the textbook. At the level of primary school pupils, some knowledge about typicality and warning them, as it were, about stereotyping. It goes on to eating. And again, I'm not sure how much you can read here, but then it says, where and with whom do you eat? With whom do you eat breakfast? And there are some bar charts there. On the left, it says alone, with my family, with my friends, not at all. Where do you eat breakfast? In my room, in the kitchen, in the living room, on the go. Other places, not at all. With whom do you eat dinner? And then again, alone, with my family, and where do you eat dinner? So the same question again, and bar charts for the students to look at. And then on the right-hand side, they're asked to do this bar chart for themselves, and the class would make their own bar chart once they've done their survey in the class. And they, of course, will be using English to do that. And then on the right-hand side, there is something slightly different. It says, did you know that in 1894 in France, factory workers had to leave the building during their lunch break? By having everyone leave, and not just for 20 minutes, they could open the windows and doors and get fresh air in. This helped keep everyone healthy. How long do you think their lunch break was? Look on the internet for more information. So again, I think it's important. What's happening here is discovering and analyzing your own society and your own self and your own behaviors. And those, I've just written those out, those are the questions which you might not have been able to read on the previous slide. So there's that discovery, procedural knowledge again, analysis by bar chart. Very simple. We're talking about primary school children, probably aged about 10 or 11 at this stage. But then in addition to that, there's something interesting that the textbook stimulates curiosity. Because I said that I see language learners as people who we hope will become curious ethnographers. And this is something which quite deliberately stimulates their curiosity. Did you know that? And then something which is rather exotic about 19th century France, but also then encourages them to use the internet to, but there again, beware of the internet, make sure they use the internet critically to find out more for themselves. Let me go back, and there on at the bottom right-hand side, there is part of the quote which says, we are who we eat with. We are who we eat with. What do you think this quote means? So that again is something which is trying to stimulate their curiosity, make them think about the whole question of eating and behavior, and not just what they eat, but that this is a social behavior and it has effects upon their relationships with people. Now, you might think that's all very well, but that's a new textbook which is dealing with things in a different manner. It's not like the traditional textbook where you would have information about a family in another country, and the textbooks for teaching French, which I think are still used to some extent, but which traditionally gave pictures of a French family, and usually a stereotypical family, father, mother, 2 children and a dog, as it were, living in a house with a garden. In the textbook I've just shown you, there was more than one kind of family. There was such a family, but there was also a family with a stepmother and stepchildren and so on. So, but what do you do if all you have is a traditional textbook? My suggestion is that your students should be searching for information on housing, just to take that, to find out whether the textbook family living in a house with a garden is something that is actually the case in the country in question. So using the internet to discover, using the internet critically, and we may have to contribute to teaching young people to use the internet critically, but of course that too is something that they learn in other subjects and not just in ours. But what I'm emphasizing then is that they can look for information and challenge that stereotype which many textbooks still present to us. They can then do what the Norwegian textbook suggested, compare their own families with and talk with learning partners and do the kind of thing that the textbook that I've shown you suggests. They carry out small-scale research in the classroom or perhaps in their environment. They can be given homework to carry out some small-scale research about their families and about the topic in question, how many people live in a house in our city and how many people live in a flat, etc., in an apartment. So they can do that kind of thing, even starting from a traditional textbook, and they can do that using English as the medium of learning about themselves, and they can then prepare a presentation of families in their own group, their own class, and compare their own group with statistics from their own society, and that too will help them to think about variation in their own society and to what extent their group is representative of their society or not. And I think it will be important that they be encouraged to prepare a PowerPoint or something about their life, where they live, the housing in which they live, etc. But prepare it for an imagined group. It needn't be a real group, but an imagined group in the country that the textbook has been showing them. So if it were a textbook showing a so-called typical British family, then the outcome of this exercise would be that your students, would prepare a PowerPoint which they would pretend to present to a partner group in Britain. And the reason for that is that they would then try to imagine what will be found different and interesting by the partner group in Britain. And in that sense, they will begin to look at themselves from the outside, see themselves as others see them, to use that well-used phrase. So that's a suggestion about how one can move from the traditional presentation of propositional knowledge, often stereotype, to something which emphasizes procedural knowledge with your students. And I hope you could see that that's something which can be applied not just to this particular topic and with this particular age group, but with any age group and other topics. Now I want to go back to the propositional knowledge, having emphasized just now procedural knowledge. And I want to make a further distinction in propositional knowledge. Before the break, I talked about propositional knowledge about another country, another culture, another social group, including our own. Propositional knowledge about. I know that in country X, 70% of the population live in villages, or 90% of the population live in flats or apartments, or whatever knowledge that I have about another country. Another kind of propositional knowledge is knowledge about intercultural communication. And this is going further than the traditional knowledge about another country. But it's a kind of propositional knowledge which is very important if we really take seriously intercultural communication and intercultural competence. It's knowledge about what helps and hinders intercultural communication. So it's theoretical knowledge about intercultural communication, but theoretical knowledge made appropriate for our learners. And since I've been talking about primary school, let me continue in the same way. Theoretical knowledge about stereotype. Already in the previous exercise, the students were asked the question, is your family a typical family? So the question was already raised. And in the further pages of the textbook, actually much further on in the textbook, they have a section, and we don't need to read all of the textbook, all of the text, but there is a text about stereotypes. It begins, a stereotype is an overly simple picture we have of a particular type of person or thing. And it goes on, a good example of this is a skunk, and so on. I'm not going to go into, but the topic is made, of stereotyping is made appropriate for the students. And if you look at the picture at the bottom left-hand side, it says a stereotype about Norwegians is that they love cross-country skiing. Do you think this is true? Why not? Do you like cross-country skiing? Do you know any Norwegians who do not like to go cross-country skiing? So, of course, the students have knowledge about themselves and their society, or at least the people around them. So it's appropriate to introduce the notion of stereotype in a way which is accessible to them, but also then apply it to their own knowledge of themselves in order to make them think more deeply about what a stereotype is and whether it is true. And of course, it is never true. Stereotypes are never true because there are always exceptions. And then on the right-hand side, you can see it says, in this picture, there are two men on. Where do you think they are from? Explain how you came to your conclusion. And this is a means of making the student discover and reflect upon. So again, it's procedural knowledge combined with knowledge about stereotypes, propositional knowledge. And then it tells them the men in the picture are referred to as gauchos, a group of very skilled horsemen who look after cattle in the wild. In the background, you can see the Andes Mountains. Where are the Andes Mountains? And that, of course, is discussed with the teacher. And then it says, previously, you made a guess about where these men were from. Was your guess correct? What in the picture influenced your guess? If your guess was wrong, what does it say about the assumption you made based on the picture? Why do you think the authors included this picture in the book? So it's part of making the students think about how stereotypes arise and to what extent and how they notice things about people and can quickly stereotype them and need to think about the dangers of that. it goes on. I'm not going to emphasize this too much, but there's more about stereotypes at the level of the teachers. And on the right-hand side, it says, can you think of any stereotypes that you've heard? For example, boys are, girls are, Norwegians are, the English are, people from the city are, farmers are, athletes are. And the final question on the right, should we avoid stereotypes? Why not? How can we avoid stereotyping? So in that way, students are given knowledge about of a second kind, the second kind of knowledge about intercultural communication, what I call type 2 knowledge about intercultural communication, in this case, knowledge about stereotypes. They're also given knowledge about culture, and the textbook includes the famous iceberg concept of culture. I won't go on into that in great detail. There's also knowledge about communication and about pragmatics and discourse and so on, presented at the level of the student. Those of you who teach in universities will have other ways of dealing with this, but knowledge of type 2 is important in intercultural competence. So in terms of methods, let me just summarize. I can see the time is moving on. First of all, I'm emphasizing that procedural knowledge is important, and I've tried to show how one can teach procedural knowledge, how learners can learn to discover and to analyze and to present data. And secondly, I've said that it's important to teach not just knowledge of type 1 about other countries and ourselves, but also, more importantly, in this, about communication. So teaching knowledge about, proposition knowledge about communication and about ourselves and others, alongside teaching procedural knowledge. That's what I've been saying so far under methods. Let me now move to materials. So I'm thinking now about what I call type 1 knowledge about, traditionally, knowledge about another country. Now, knowledge about ourselves as well as knowledge about another country. But let's go a little further. What would that mean for university students? What kind of knowledge of type 1 should we be giving university students? I've used examples from school pupils, primary school pupils, because to show that they too can acquire knowledge. As Bruno said, anything can be taught to anyone as long as you find the right way of doing it. So for university students, I want to ask you now to think which topics should be included. I've shown typical topics for primary school, the family, eating, and so on. But what about university students? We had earlier the distinction between English as a foreign language, and it could be that you teach English majors. And as part of your teaching, you do focus on English-speaking countries. So you may have to think about what would be the topics that should be included if you're focusing on English as a foreign language as spoken in country X. But we also said that English as an international or world language needs to have topics. It inevitably has culture connected with it. We all bring our language, our culture and cultural understandings to lingua franca English. But what about the topics which should be included if you're thinking of teaching English as a lingua franca or as a world language? That's my question to you. What should happen? How do we get to what should happen? Because as somebody famously said, you cannot get a should from an is. There's nothing in the way that we do things now that tells us what should happen in the future. There is no natural development from what we traditionally do to what we should do. We have to have a means of thinking about what we should do. We need principles, arguments, axioms, humanist principles, arguments, actions, since humanistic approaches are important. But what are the principles that you would use if you're going to say, okay, I need to rethink the topics or propositional knowledge of type 1 for my course? What do you teach? What topics do you teach at the moment? Are they in English as a foreign language? Are they in English as a world language? Do you teach about other countries or about our country, or do you teach general? And I thought we might try to use the chat to introduce. I'm trying to find, yeah, there we are. And if you can put into the chat just words or phrases, which we might quickly share the topics, 3 or more topics or themes, but perhaps not more, just 3 will be sufficient since we're such a large group. I didn't know we'd be so many. Into the chat, things that you teach now as a foreign language or as a world language. I will open my chat. So somebody has said as EFL. Yes. So you're teaching English as a foreign language. What are the themes that you teach in EFL is my question. What are the topics that you teach? What are the themes that you teach? Festivals, okay. In a specific country, festivals in Britain, festivals in the United States, for example, is that what you're saying? Not really.
Not
No, what
really.
do you?
Not really.
Well, tell us what you do teach, and other people as well. I'd like to see more around the town jobs for some. And again, the question. So these in your own country, is this what you're saying?
Is the question for me?
Yes. When you say festivals in which country is my question. Perhaps other people will put.
There are 2 people who talked about festivals, Kun Suripan and Kun Birani. I'm trying to get them to respond to your question.
Yeah. Yes, I know. Yes. And I wonder if other people will just put 1 word or 2 word phrases into the chat so we can see. So EFL giving tips about life in the US is what Kitty Pong says. Yes. Are there others? Places, hobbies, jobs in a specific country. Is that what that implies? Places, hobbies, jobs in the United States, for example. Somebody says certain festival in various countries, which would in a sense be treating English as a world language, looking at it as a means of finding out about other countries than English-speaking countries. That would be world language topic. Superstition of different countries. Again, that would be a world language. Right? And somebody says I teach English as a second language. That is slightly different from EFL, of course. And EFL, International Table, etiquettes, right? So what I see in different cultures, what I see is topic from English as a world language. But here is one which focuses on Anglophone countries, music, career, films, movies, entertainment. Okay, greetings, food, superstitions, celebrations, movies. Again, is this English as a foreign language and therefore English-speaking countries? Popuyu, I'm not sure how to pronounce. Or is this world language English? Business card exchanges. Right. Thank you. Kit. Culture in Southeast Asian countries. Yeah, okay. So again, that's world language rather than English as a language spoken in English-speaking countries. Okay. Well, time is marching on. So that gives us then some, thank you for sharing those topics and ideas. What I would now, here's one more, I think, Kim. Culmination of different cultures such as music, dance, and other forms of art where English language is the theme. So again, I think that I would see that as more of a world language approach than an EFL approach. Thank you, James. I will move on. So that is, in a sense, what is the case. That is what we do at the moment, what you do at the moment. So what can we do with that? We can take that material, and perhaps you do this already. It seems to me that some of what you were saying has been said, is what I'm about to say, that you then take those topics about other countries and it becomes the purpose of the teaching and the task of the students to use their procedural skills independently. As I said before, often taught in other subjects, you don't have to teach them everything, to look at whatever the topic is, music, table manners, whatever the topics were in the chat, to discover them, analyze them in our own society, and then to compare with what they have been taught or what they've learnt about the topic in another society, and present what they've done, what they've found out about themselves and their own society, as if they were speaking to people from another society. And that requires them to decenter. And I think it also requires them to think critically about themselves and their own society. I mean, superficial iceberg matters such as table manners and so on is also something which needs to be thought about critically, but certainly when you go to deeper issues of values in a society, that's when students become more thoughtful and critical about themselves. And to emphasize to them that they should not leave their imagined audience with stereotypes of us. They have to think carefully about how they're going to avoid that. And that will be, therefore, encouraging, requiring them to use their propositional knowledge of type 2, their propositional knowledge about, in this case, stereotypes, but any propositional knowledge about communication. Now, what should be taught? Perhaps these are things that you've thought about already, and you have your reasons. But this time, if you would like to put in the chat, or maybe we can open the microphones to say, okay, what one or two or three topics you think should be taught, but then why should they be taught? What are your reasons for wanting to teach music or table manners, just to mention two of the things that I remember from the list? Yes, I can see there were some further topics, but I would like to now go on and ask you what you think should be taught and why. And again, try to put it in brief notes. Give us one topic and why. It might be something that's already been mentioned, or it might be something new, but the important thing is, what is the reason behind your topic? Now it becomes more difficult. Why questions are always more difficult. British mannerism, okay? Green technology. Okay, why green technology? Why jargons? These are things you think ought to be taught. Why? Okay, so they don't offend others from other cultures, right? What lies behind that? What are the values? What are the reasonings? What are the rationales for your humanistic rationales, if I can put it in that way? How are you trying to educate your students as well as teach them a useful skill or set of skills? And behind the question, behind the last one on the list, do's and don'ts, so they won't offend others. Well, beneath that are values of good behavior and positive interactions with people. Empathy, yes, empathy is behind that as well. It's an empathetic perspective, and empathy is something which we value as humanists, as humanistic thinking people. Avoid bullying others, yes, okay. Nothing more coming immediately. But, again, thinking of the humanistic values of all this, of course, ensuring that communication is not non-violent, empathy, these are important values that we want to emphasize in our teaching, our humanistic teaching. Okay, I'll go on because, again, as usual, time is marching on. Maybe we should also include social issues in our own society. Maybe we should include migration as a social issue. It's a very hot topic at the moment in the United Kingdom, and of course in Australia and the USA. It may be a hot topic in your country, or maybe not in Thailand. We had a discussion yesterday evening about this, but there are other people present in the Zoom in other countries. But even if it's not a hot topic, maybe it's something that if you're a student of an English major, with being a serious student of life in another country, in another English-speaking country, then migration is a topic which needs to be included. But perhaps if you're a student or if you're teaching English as a world language, then rather than focusing upon English-speaking countries, there's another basis for our rationale for teaching certain topics. And the Sustainable Development Goals, which I'm sure you're all aware of from the United Nations, is a basis and a clearly argued basis, a good rationale, a good humanistic rationale for introducing certain topics. And what is interesting about the Sustainable Development Goals is that there's a lot of materials available on the internet. You can easily find them. You don't have to copy those links. You can easily find them. they will have to be developed to be adapted for teaching in English, in an English classroom, adapted to the level of the students that you have, both their language level and their level of maturation, whether we're talking about primary, secondary, or university students, because those materials are usually thought of as to be used by teachers, Thai teachers in Thai schools, or English teachers in English schools, etc. They're not usually the ones that I've looked at and thought of for foreign language teaching, but they can be easily adapted. So what I'm trying to say is, look at issues, social issues, which are present in your own society particularly, and migration may not be present as an issue in your society. You might still want to introduce it because it's an important topic if you're a student of English as a major and a student of the United States or the United Kingdom. But if you're teaching and learning English as a world language, EFL, English lingua franca, then there are other reasonings, other rationales, and the Sustainable Development Goals provide us with a good rationale, which is much better way of thinking about these things than the somewhat arbitrary way and non-systematic ways in which textbooks and teaching materials are usually developed. It's time for me to move on and to summarize. You've been sitting there for almost an hour again, and I'm very grateful for your concentration. So in terms of summary of materials, what I'm emphasizing is that, yes, there is type 1 knowledge, and there are topics and themes to be taught in our lessons, but I'm also emphasizing that whether it's English as a foreign language or English as a world language, in both cases, one needs to have good rationales, principles, purposes, which might well be what are broadly called humanistic, but that those type 1 knowledge topics and themes should also be relevant to our own society, because humanistic teaching, as presented by the Norwegian document or the Chinese document or whatever else, humanistic teaching is an emphasis as much upon learning about ourselves as learning about others. So I will stop. I suggest 3 takeaways for you. I hope there may be other takeaways. One is that materials and methods should have a purpose, and I would suggest it should have a humanistic purpose as well as an instrumental purpose. Secondly, knowledge of type 2, procedural knowledge, know-how, is more important than know that, but that does not mean forget know that and type 1 knowledge, because type 1 knowledge is also important in propositional knowledge, and knowledge therefore of type 1 kind should be topics which are compatible with the purposes. And if the humanistic purposes are to learn as much about ourselves as about others, then we need to choose topics which will be compatible with that. Those are my 3 takeaways, and I thank you very much for this afternoon. I'm very happy to listen to questions, but maybe Chairperson, we have a short break, as it were, 2 or 3 minutes while people breathe and think, and then put things into the chat.
5 minutes maybe, Professor?
If you wish, yes, 5 minutes will be, yes, let's do that.
Let's meet again at 3:10 local time in Thailand. So basically in 5 minutes with questions and discussion points, issues and so on. Thank you. See you in 5. So we are going to resume our session in 1 minute. I hope that you are ready for the last leg of the conference. If you're ready, please come back, and then we're waiting for Professor Michael Byram. Prepare your questions for any discussion or any things that you would like to ask the professor. This is our chance to get educated and to get better, to enhance our practices and, you know, become a better teacher, so to speak. Okay, so we're waiting for him to come back in about a minute or so. Again, you can type your questions in the chat box below. I actually prefer that you can talk to the professor yourself, even though you put your questions down. All right, hi. Here's Professor Byram. Can I just draw your attention to the message before last? Kun Sakseth has raised an issue, Professor, about English language use within the Thai society. Would you like to respond to that?
There's something in the chat. Did you
Yes,
say?
yes. The one before last. This was when you asked the audience
okay.
to
Yes. Okay. English language use within Thai. Yes, I see that. I forgot the name of the person. Sakletsu. Yes. Yes, I agree that what you're talking about is English as a foreign language, even though you might be using it with your pupils, learners, to talk about Thai society. It's a foreign language in Thailand. It's not like English as a second language in, I think of Nigeria always as an example, and some other African countries where you have the old colonial language, which has become the general shared language among a lot of people who speak different languages, and it is a national language alongside many others. South Africa is another example. That's English as a second language, but in Thailand, English is a foreign language, even when you're using it to talk with your pupils about Thailand. And I would also say that talking with your pupils about Thailand is precisely the kind of point I was making, that helps them to think about themselves as much as about others. And thinking about themselves is ultimately more important than knowing about Britain or whatever. It's important to know about Britain, but it's more important, if you really want to make a contrast, to think about themselves and critically analyze themselves. So I think we are in agreement on that.
Okay. Is there any questions that you would like to ask Professor Byram? This is your chance. You can turn on your microphone and then ask him directly.
Please feel free to just make comments. You do not have to formulate what you want to say as a question. I'm quite happy just to have comments which may not need a response from me. Anything will do. Anything is correct. Anything is good. Shall I?
I've got a question. Can I ask you a question, if you don't mind?
Yes. Please.
First of all, good morning. Still morning from France. I can't believe. So this is my first time actually attending a webinar where you are speaking. I've got, mixed feelings about this webinar. It seems like everyone in the world has a twin, absolutely, and you have reminded me of an old colonial mine, a very old friend of mine from Somerset, from Bath, from the south of England. who passed away years ago, Terry George Potter. And so I've got a little bit, strange feelings. Anyway, okay, so thank you for this wonderful session. It's been really, really fruitful, particularly for English like me, who teach English in Thailand. So here's my question. Actually, I had two questions for you, Professor Mike, and one of them has already been answered by you, because my question was like, how can we educators effectively integrate authentic intercultural materials into our curricula to enhance our students' intercultural communicative competence? I have got my answers.
Oh, good.
This. Yes, I've got my answers for this. But my second question is, what practical methods or approaches would you recommend for assessing the development of our language learners' intercultural competence?
Well, that's a big question for a big question. But
thank you.
Essentially, I mean, to be brief, because this is not the time to go into long answers, but essentially, I would say the approach to take is through ongoing assessment based upon some kind of portfolio approach, where students do things of the kind I've been saying, where they carry out little research projects or whatever it may be, or they compare texts, and you then look at what they're doing and assess their work over time. It's very difficult to assess procedural knowledge in some kind of end of course exam. It's very difficult to do that. It's not impossible, because you can give them data and you can ask them to analyze data and write an analysis of data of some kind, about, take the simple example of food in Britain or whatever it may be. It's possible to do that, but that requires time, and it's not going to be, it requires time in an examination or a test, but it's possible to do that. Otherwise, it has to be ongoing assessment. But if I draw your attention, use that as an excuse to draw your attention to my last slide there, John Corbett, in his book, which is a second edition of a very good book, also has a very good discussion at length about assessment. So John Corbett's book is certainly worth thinking about.
Noted, sir. Thank you for the answer.
There is one question in the chat box. I think it's a short one, so I probably could read that to you and the audience. What is implicit and explicit knowledge, from Kun Virani?
Right. I wonder why that question is being asked. And would Virani like to explain why she's asking that question? There must be something behind it. I mean,
Kun Virani, are you here?
I mean, the direct answer to the question is a distinction. The students asked me. Okay. The direct answer to your students would be, implicit knowledge is what you have in your head, but which I, as a teacher, cannot see or know about. And therefore, you have to make your knowledge explicit to me. You have to articulate it in some way. You have to speak it out. You have to write it down. That is the distinction between implicit and explicit that I think we teachers use when we're talking to students about their knowledge. I don't know if that's the answer that answers your question. That's what I guess is behind the question.
Well, if probably someone
Yes.
is thinking about the question, So I might as well ask you one question that has been, lurking in my mind. Before I started the English language teaching journey, I was actually, my very first job was at the refugee camp in the eastern part of Thailand. And I was actually put in the section called cultural orientation. And that camp was the aim of that camp was to put to try to educate I think people from Laos, from Vietnam, from Cambodia, people from Hill tribe people to go to America, as they call the third country then. I don't know the political agreement behind this camp, but it's all legit and everything. The thing is that I was put in the orientation program, cultural orientation program, aiming to educate all the refugees before they settle themselves in America. I was put there to my surprise, even though I was never in America back then. I've never been to America now. I mean, never ever. So maybe sometime in the future. The question that has crossed my mind is that can cultural information be taught in the classroom? So the classroom, the cultural orientation classroom, was designed to teach all the refugees some American cultures. For example, you should try to get jobs as soon as possible, because you shouldn't rely on the coupons or the social services of any kind, that kind of thing. They teach you tribe people to know how things function in the kitchen. Mind you, this was about 20 years ago. So nowadays the internet connection and everything is available. So people may laugh at the idea, but the setting then was about 20 30 years ago. I was never in America, but I was given this material to teach students. So I just went by the book. On my side, it was okay because I got educated myself about America. I just graduated from the university then. But on the students' part, I heard them talk something like, we have never seen America. What kind of life would that be? I couldn't imagine so and so. So again, can cultural awareness be taught, Professor?
Well, yes, you're talking about propositional knowledge about life in the United States, and that can be taught. Whether it's learned or not is a different matter, but it can be taught in different ways. And of course, they can read a book about life in America, or they can be given a series of tips about life in America, in the United States, of the kind which will help them to deal with life in the first weeks or whatever. And I mean, it can be propositional knowledge of the kind how to open a bank account. It can be propositional knowledge about how to respond to someone who invites you to their home. It can be all that kind of thing. And it's propositional knowledge which they can read or see examples of or be taught in one way or another. But the teaching will, as we all know, teaching of propositional knowledge, okay, here is a text, read it and learn it by heart, is not going to be very effective, because propositional knowledge doesn't always become procedural knowledge. They might have learned about, in Thailand, in the refugee camp, how to respond if you're given if somebody invites you to their home. But when it happens, all that propositional knowledge goes out of their heads often. It's a bit like using the third person singular S. We all know we should have an S on the end, but many people when speaking don't put it there, even highly competent speakers. So yes, it can be taught, but I think it's and in that case, it will be useful. But you need to find methods of teaching, and people who are in what was earlier called cross-cultural training do have methods. They have experiential methods for teaching, which will role play and so on, which will be more effective than learning propositional knowledge. How effective? I say more effective is not necessarily going to be 100% effective, but at least it will give people a start. And there is a lot of work, as I say, in cross-cultural training, which finds experiential methods of teaching and learning.
Okay, I think we have one more question, chat box. Two.
Yeah.
Right, let's go with the first one. Yes, okay. What framework?
What they use in developing cultural competence? It's neutral stance. Well, I'm not. If you mean by neutral that it's simply use learning for instrumental purposes, as opposed to the humanistic or other purposes that I contrasted with the instrumental, then most of what I've said this afternoon, or what John Corbett says, or the book by Tomlinson, has materials for and ideas for teaching people procedural and propositional knowledge without encouraging critical stance and which would lead to a humanistic or maybe even a human rights stance. That would be so, because it can lead into a more human rights orientation as well, a humanistic stance. So any of these techniques can be used, and if you do not then pursue the point of saying, well, what does this tell you about yourselves and what about our society, and what does this tell you about the strengths and weaknesses of our society? If you do not do that, you will remain neutral. I hope I'm asking. I've understood the question and answering it appropriately.
Right. Two more questions. One is about the reliability of the information on the internet from Kun Ratsami, and the other is about assessment from Kun Saksep.
Okay. Let me take the one regarding the assessment. I would also like to extend a bit further. There's a term which I'm currently researching called intercultural citizenship. Okay, if it is possible to assess the EFL students' intercultural competence, will it also be possible to assess their intercultural citizenship? For instance, if they're ICC or ICs somewhat high, will that resonate for their intercultural citizenship? What I would say in answer to that, because that again is a complex question, is that you should look for what's called the reference. Maybe I can write it in here myself. Reference framework of competences for democratic culture. The Council of Europe. That is a framework which actually would answer some of the earlier questions to some extent, because it includes it's a framework of competences which most of which are what I would call, or what are called by everybody, intercultural, but some of them are competences which are citizenship competences, and that document, or it's a set of documents, also includes discussion of assessment. I didn't think of that earlier, and also includes descriptors for assessing students. levels of citizenship and levels of intercultural competence, which descriptors which teachers can use either in the classroom or, as I was saying earlier, possibly to evaluate or to assess an examination product. So descriptors in the reference framework of competence for democratic culture, you'll find it easily, I'm sure, is a means of finding more about assessment of intercultural citizenship as well as intercultural competence.
Okay. So the last
There was
question.
one
Okay,
there's
sorry.
one above. There was one above. You said we could be careful about searching for information. How can we be sure that the information our students search is trustworthy, neutral, or updated enough? Well, we cannot, of course. We can only be careful, and we need to, I think, educate our students to be careful, and that it be part of their own approach to the internet, rather than we becoming the final arbiters, the final judges of whether what they found is updated enough. Of course, we can also check ourselves, but we can never be absolutely sure. But I think it's a question of approach and attitude rather than trying to be definite that something is right or wrong in these matters. I think that was
I guess that's the last question. Over to you, Ajahn Sane, so that you could invite the Dean to.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Sanut, for your nice coordination, right? I believe we learned a lot from Ajahn Byram today. Sounds like we have placed a small scale Thailand TESOL in this webinar, right? I was very happy that we made the right decision. As I said earlier, that we plan to have an on-site works for everyone. However, when we learned from Ajahn Mike about your sickness, we were about to cancel. But Ajahn Mike insisted, right, to help us. So we switched to the online version today. Now we got, I think, over 100 participants to the Zoom. So this is the best decision we have made, right? Thank you so much, Ajahn Mike, to share your knowledge with us, right? And then I think many of us learn how to use some certain approaches, right? Could be EFL or English as a whole language, right? EIL or EFL depends, right? And then some certain topics were already provided. So I believe we might see something very soon in terms of publication as the end products of Ajahn Byram's today. So I would like to invite our Dean, Dr. Pasapong, to come back to our session again, please.
So thank you very much. So once again, I would like to express my appreciation to Professor Michael Byram for coming here today to meet us online today. And then I think he gave us lots of ideas, practical ideas, and then the responses to our questions can be very useful for everyone here as well. And yeah, I think I agree with Vice Dean Sane that this is one of the best, seminars here, because we got, people from different parts of the world. Maybe this kind of topic, right? I think that's something we have to do. We should draw, people from different parts of the world to discuss issues about intercultural communication. So that's the way it should be. So thank you very much from all of you coming from different, places. And I wish this would not be the last time we meet here like this. So I'm sure Dr. Sane will organize more webinars like this, and then we can see you again in the coming events. Thank you very much. Thank you. สวัสดีครับ
ขอบคุณค่ะ Thank you very much. Thank you so much อาจารย์ Mike. Dr. Sane.
Thank you, Dean, and thank you, Sane.
You are teaching, right,
Dr.
Ajahn,
Pong and
today
Sane.
in the evening?
Yes,
Okay.
no, I'm not teaching this evening. I'm teaching tomorrow morning.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, nothing. Yeah, so
Mhm.
the rest of the day I
Alright.
can relax. Yes,
That's
yes.
good.
And
That's
thank you,
good.
all of you. Thank you for your questions and comments. And it was very interesting to listen to those. And I hope that I managed to answer, at least to some extent, your very thoughtful comments and questions.
Right. From the question, I believe that everyone wants to learn more from you again, Ajahn. That maybe
Well,
some
thank you for the
in
invitation.
future,
It
right?
was very. Thank you very
Right.
much.
Okay.
Okay.
ค่ะ
Okay,
Please
take
take
care then.
care.
Bye-bye.
Please
So
take care ค่ะอาจารย์
see you.
Okay,
Bye-bye.
bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye bye. Thank you.
Thank you everyone. Bye.